This is Ron Brown, and I am recording a class on one of the most fascinating neighborhoods of New York City, and this is the Lower East Side. So let's get going, and hopefully everything will work out fine. Okay, hello everybody. This is Ron Brown, Dr. Ronald Brown, and I'm going to give you a tour today of one of the most exciting neighborhoods of New York City. Now, of course, every neighborhood in New York City is very, very exciting, but the Lower East Side has a unique characteristic because it has hosted so many different and absolutely magnificent people through its history. I'm going to adjust my light a little bit better here so you can see me and the background. So once again, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Now, if you look at the left, you see the outline. We're going to be talking about the very early settlers in the Lower East Side, who were the Scotch and English. In the early 1800s, they were the predominant group in the Lower East Side. By the mid-1800s, there was the beginning of the Irish immigration. Fleeing the potato famine, you had your first German Jews showing up, and you had a very small trickle of Chinese that continued. Chinese are the only group that's a permanent fixture of the Lower East Side and that area of Lower Manhattan. Other groups have come and gone, but the Chinese have been forever. The third group will be the Eastern European Orthodox Jews, which is one of the most famous and well-known chapters of the Lower East Side from the 1870s, beginning until World War I. Then came the Chinese and the Hispanic populations. And we'll finish up with a look into the future. So who's going to be next? Is this going to be the aliens coming in? So let's get started. As usual, I'll be talking for about 45 minutes to an hour. I tend to be a bit long-winded. And then we will wrap it up. So let's get going. First and foremost, where is the Lower East Side? Now, if you look at the map in front of you, in the upper right-hand corner, you see the Lower East Side. East Broadway, one of the main drags going through. Henry Street is there. Canal Street is up there. It's that corner on the East River. Go a little bit further inland, you get to Little Italy. A little bit below that, you get to Chinatown. And just below that, you see City Hall. So you have three distinct ethnic neighborhoods. At the very bottom of Manhattan, the old historic part of Manhattan. You can see there's no grid plan down here. There are no avenues running north and south and streets running east and west. It is a hodgepodge, a couple square blocks here, and then a curving street cutting off to the right and to the left. And so we are here at the bottom in the old part of New York City. The Dutch, who settled below Wall Street, you see that very small area below Wall Street. North of that was the British part from 1664. Now, continuing, the very first group who settled in the Lower East Side, only slides you're going to see LES. That's not the French article, plural. It is Lower East Side. Well, already in the colonial period, as you can see on the map on the left, 1776, you see the lower part of Manhattan going up to about Chamber Street and a little bit above it, and then a little neighborhood over to the right, pushing over to the East River. Well, that was the area that eventually became the Lower East Side. Now, on the right, you can see what is generally considered the Lower East Side today, from Canal Street going down. that is a much larger area, but it began as a very, very small neighborhood in the beginning. Now, it was called Lower East Side, not because there was an Upper East Side at that time. It was called a Lower East Side because it was low-lying. It was swampy. And as you can see in the map on the left, the map of Lower Manhattan, you can see there's Collect Pond, and in the upper part, there are just a bunch of swamps. They were not lakes. They were really swamps, shallow, stagnant. When it would rain, they would overflow. And you can see the area on the right, the famous 5 Points area, which is today Chinatown, Little Italy, Lower East Side. When there was a rainstorm or a snowstorm, these buildings would be filled with water, sometimes even flooding up to the ground floor. That's why it was called the Lower East Side, because it was low-lying, swampy, which means it was malaria infested, means it was cholera afflicted. Every type of disease available would concentrate in the Lower East Side. The famous 5 Points area there, notorious. You can see the picture in the upper right, an old wooden building, barely standing up. Later on, there would be more brick buildings, but there was filled with cows and chickens. Pigs were everywhere. Pigs were the garbage cleaners of the time because the pigs would eat anything. So they were the garbage collectors. It was called 5 Points because 5 streets came together. So this was the area where the poor immigrants clustered. Rents were cheap. It was dangerous. It was crime infested. But for new immigrants just off of the boat from England or from Scotland, you had no choice. So you settled where you could. Well, one of the first groups that arrived there were English Methodists. Now, the good quality English people were of the Church of England, what we call in the United States the Episcopal Church. They were the upper class. Baptists and Methodists were lower class. And so when the Methodists started arriving in the early 1800s and late 1700s, they, of course, settled in the Lower East Side because that was the only place available. Well, one of the first things they did when they would get organized is they would build their church. And here we see the Willett Street Methodist Church, which was built in 1826, one of the older churches in New York City. Well, of course, as we're going to see as we go along, a group settles in the Lower East Side as soon as it gets the chance and the possibility, it is off and running and moves somewhere else. And so gradually the Willett Street Methodist Church became an Orthodox Jewish synagogue by the 1870s and 80s when the English and the Scots were long gone and the Orthodox Jews were moving in. Now, if you look closely, the churches of the Lower East Side, these were made of fieldstone. These are black Manhattan schist, which you see in Central Park. These are the stones which you dig out of the ground. So not a lot of money was spent on building this church. It was made of fieldstone, no ornate decorations or anything, but it was made by the people who lived there. Another church which dates from approximately the same period is the St. Augustine's Episcopal Church. Now, not all Episcopalians were rich. It was the established Church of England, which meant if you wanted to be anybody or go anywhere or go to the university, you had to be Episcopalian. But there were a lot of peasants and farmers out in the countryside who were formerly Episcopalian. And when they migrated, they had no money, many of them, so they settled in the Lower East Side. And here we see on the very famous Henry Street, another very simple church structure, Gothic windows made with stone. And you can see that at some point they lost its wooden tower in a storm or something. This church is rather famous because in the picture on the bottom right, you see a wooden balcony inside the church. Don't forget, New York City was a slave-holding city. In fact, it was in 1829 when slavery was finally abolished. But the church had an upper balcony for slaves and free blacks. That balcony was marked BM, which means black members. So New York had a large slave population, and many of them were eventually got to be well-to-do or could buy their freedom. Slavery was abolished in 1829, but still there was segregation. Another church, which dates from a little bit later, is the originally the Rutgers Street Presbyterian Church. Now, this was the city's first Presbyterian. Now, as you know, the Presbyterians, that's the national church of Scotland. So Henry Rutgers came over, 1745, settled in the Lower East Side, a poor Scottish farmer, and got together a bunch of other Scots and built this church. You can see how it was originally on the left, rather elaborate with the horses and buggies. Today, as you can see it on the right. Now, Rutgers, you say, I'm sure you say, that name sounds familiar. Well, think of Rutgers University over in New Jersey. Like Henry Rutgers, like every other resident of the swampy Lower East Side, as soon as he got the chance, he was up and gone. And this was one hardworking Scotsman who became successful. Well, as the Scots moved away, gradually the Irish Catholics were moving in. They bought the church. And today it is St. Teresa's Roman Catholic Church. Another church, which dates from the period, is an English group of Lutherans. And this church dates back to 1801, and it went through several incarnations, beginning with as a Lutheran church, became Episcopalian, and then finally it became a Catholic church, Irish Catholics. But as the Irish Catholics moved away, it eventually became a Chinese Catholic church. There are lots of Chinese from who have migrated, and so they took over the church. And this church is still standing. Now, here in the picture on the right, you see an old photograph of the probably the 1910s or 20s, showing Mott Street, where the church is located. And as we're going to see in a second, that has been a Chinese hangout since colonial times. Now, there were always a group of Chinese in what today we consider the Lower East Side, or that larger area, 5 Points, Little Italy, Chinatown. And Mott Street has been a area where the Chinese settled since colonial times. Now you see at the bottom on the right, you see actually the building in the distance is Peter Stuyvesant's house. It was called the White House, or it's called the White Hall. There's a street right down there that's still called White Hall Street, named after Governor Stuyvesant's private residence. But you can see there were ships in the harbor, both on the right and on the left. The major export of New York was beaver pelts. The beaver skins were waterproof. And so you could have loads of ships that would leave New Amsterdam and later New York, sail over to China with a load of pelts. Well, back then in the early 1800s, you had to go the whole way around Argentina, South America, cross the Pacific, and go to China or Indonesia, wherever the pelts were sold, load up with tea and porcelain and silk, and come back to New York. Well, many sailors would die en route, either through a storm or pirates or disease. And so when the ship got to China, it would pick up a bunch of young Chinese guys out for adventure. They would work on the ship, sail back to New York, and end up staying for a couple of years before they would go back to China, and with the gold that they had earned here, hopefully buy a farm or something. So you've always had a small Chinese population in the area, which is the Lower East Side and larger area of Little Italy and Chinatown. Well, the English and the Scots gradually got some money. And of course, the first thing they were going to do was leave that swampy, low-lying, unhealthy, dangerous area. Well, by the 1840s, there was the potato famine in Ireland. Hundreds of thousands of impoverished Irish were fleeing into the country. And so, as you can see, the Thomas Nast cartoon on the left, of course, there was no love for the Irish Catholics. You can see the good white Protestants standing on the land there, and these Irish immigrants wearing the Pope's crown coming in, the invasion with the Vatican in the background. So the Irish were despised. They were impoverished. They didn't speak English. They spoke Gaelic, plus they were Catholics to boot. So they fled to the Lower East Side, mainly because they had no money and there was so much anti-Catholic racism. Large numbers of Germans, look at the map at the bottom, that eventually became Germany in the late 1800s. Well, there were a series of wars and revolutions. The 1845 revolution, which totally destroyed large sections of Germany in the war. So many young Germans would just say, oh, I've had enough of this, and would up and migrate. Whether they had any money or not, they migrated. The more well-to-do ones would live in a decent area. If they had a profession, they could work their profession. The poor ones settled in the Lower East Side. Map on the right, we see Great Britain. England is pink. You see Wales. In the north is Scotland and the island of Ireland. And the English Protestants had no love for the Irish or the Scots. And so they migrated to America. Well, the Irish were very well organized. In spite of their poverty, in spite of their lack of skills, they were farmers. They couldn't survive in a city, but they had the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church organized the Irish. Here we see the very first Irish Catholic Church built as an Irish Catholic Church, not as a Protestant church, which they bought. And this is St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church on Grand Street. Well, the Irish were persecuted. See the sign, no Irish need apply. You see the cartoon, the Catholic priest as a rather vulgar creature, and the Irish immigrant portrayed as a monkey. But yet the Irish started getting organized, mainly due to the Catholic Church. Large numbers of German Lutherans came over, and they built their church in the Lower East Side in the 1850s. Well, of course, once when the German Lutherans got enough money and moved out, they sold their church, and it became a synagogue. And here we see the picture of the synagogue, which became the Shaaray Hashomayin. German Orthodox Jews took it over in 1864. It's on Rivington, was on Rivington Street. You can see as it was the last time I was there and took a picture of it. But a couple of years ago, there was a fire, probably set by arsonists to get rid of the building, because now there is a big apartment building on the spot. So rather than try to save the building, in fact, I was probably the last person in there to take pictures of the interior, and it burned like a couple of days later. And so here you see it being demolished. Once again, they were fighting landmark status. So it was better to, and this might be the case, have somebody put a torch to it, burn it down, and demolish it, so then they could build what they wanted to. But another monumental building of the Lower East Side, which is no longer there. Well, the Irish, of course, as I mentioned earlier, took over the old Rutgers Church and turned it into the Catholic Church in the 1860s. And once again, on the left, you see the rather modest tenement buildings surrounding it. Today it's all skyscrapers. You see the tower was a little bit more ornate, but it has remained through thick and thin. After it stopped being a Presbyterian church, it has remained a Catholic church until today. And this one's still standing just off of East Broadway. Today, it is the main Chinese Catholic church, the Church of the Transfiguration. And the picture on the left, you can see there's a school beside it. It's a bilingual Chinese English language school. But it only became a Chinese church after the big migration of Chinese in 1965. So for almost a century, from 1853 to 1965, it remained predominantly Irish. This is another monumental synagogue that was there, and this is a very famous place. It is called the Norfolk Street German Baptist Church. Well, on the it is a very again, a German Baptist church, which was turned into a synagogue, and it became, in about 1870s, it became an Orthodox synagogue. Now, this synagogue, as you can see, it's now closed, on the verge of collapsing. Another historic building, which is basically being neglected and hoping that someday someone will throw a match in it. You can see on the picture on the right, the skyscraper that has gone up on this lot beside it. So you can imagine if there would be an accidental, quote unquote, fire and the place would burn down, then they could build what they wanted to. But this building is very important because this is the homeland, the place where Yeshiva University was born. It began as a yeshiva, a Jewish school for boys, day school, named the Beit Midrash Hagodol. And then gradually the yeshiva grew into a college and then into a university, and one of the premier Jewish universities in the city. And once again, this one is on the verge of collapsing. Congregation Rodef Shalom, 1853. And this one was built by the Orthodox Jews when they started coming over. And it's on Clinton Street. And that one still stands. The one on the right no longer stands. This was the very first building of the Temple Emmanuel. Temple Emmanuel is the giant synagogue. In fact, it's the largest synagogue in the world on Fifth Avenue. And these were German Reform Jews. They were not the Orthodox Jews with the strings and the beards and everything, but they were Reform Jews who settled in the Lower East Side. Another German Reformed synagogue is the congregation Anshe Chesed from 1849. On Norfolk Street. As you can see, German Reformed Jews built their synagogues as if they were churches, because that's the architectural style that they knew from Germany. And so the Reformed Jews said, well, we want to have a church or a synagogue that looks like any other house of worship. Now, these old synagogues most of them do no longer have a congregation. The Anshe Chesed, today it's called the Orensanz Center, and it is used for concerts and all kinds of activities, but they also they celebrate the Jewish high holidays, and they have Jewish weddings and everything still in the building. Although it is no longer a formal synagogue, it basically, to keep the lights on and play the plumbing and put on a new roof, they have all kinds of activities, but at least the building survives, which is a blessing in itself. Now, the Lower East Side, by the time after the Civil War, there was enough money and enough people with money to invest that even the Lower East Side started getting rather large buildings, not like the old wooden ones we saw earlier. And after the Civil War, this began the golden age of tenements. On the right, you see a sign of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. You see that these early ones didn't have running water. The bathroom was down the corridor, if not an outhouse. As many people packed into the building as humanly possible. But a lot of these buildings still exist, although every time I do a tour, I see fewer and fewer of them. Once again, there was a slight trickle of Chinese. And we do know from the 1840s, there was a Chinese guy named Ken who had a general store. You can see it on Mott Street. And they had Chinese restaurants. And so the Chinese once again remained there. Most of them would come over, work for a couple of years here, save up their money, and then go back to China, where they would buy land for a farm or open a store in town. They had what they call their joss house. Joss is the slang term, I'm sure it has some origin, for an incense stick, because in the Buddhist temples, they would light incense in front of the statue or in front of a shrine. Many of the joss houses were very simple matters, although gradually some of them started growing. The picture on the left is an old picture of a very simple joss house with a Chinese writing. On the right above, you see a storefront Buddhist temple. And at the bottom is the Mahayana Buddhist temple, which is today one of the largest Buddhist temples in the city and the largest in the Lower East Side. And it claims, it's on Canal Street, it claims to have the largest statue of the Buddha in the country. Now, the special thing about the Chinese, after the Civil War, more and more started coming over, but they were only men. Chinese women did not come over. Men would jump aboard a ship, get a job, work their way over here. Some of them would migrate to California when they were building the Trans-Siberian or Transcontinental Railroad. They would work on the railroad. When they get some money, they would stop off somewhere. They'd open a candy store or what they call a washi-washi, a laundry, or a Chinese restaurant. So they were vast number of men. Well, of course, like any all-male society, whether it's soldiers or a frat house or anything else where there's only men, all kinds of things are going to be happening. And the Chinese were famous for their opium dens, gambling. To go to Chinatown meant to go have drugs, opium, gamble, drink alcohol, very often homebrew. Prostitutes were always available, Irish lower class prostitutes who didn't have any means to support themselves. And so the Chinese got a very bad reputation. Plus, they refused to convert. I mean, missionaries went down there, white Christian missionaries went down there to convert these heathens and these idol-worshiping heathens. Because you went into a Buddhist temple, there was an idol. And they saw the Chinese burning incense in front of an idol, which aggravated the good Protestants. They refused to convert to Christianity. So you had the rise of a vicious anti-Chinese sentiment, because they said not only were they bringing drugs and alcohol and prostitution and gambling and crime into the center of the city, they were idol worshipers. They refused to convert. Now, some of the more successful Chinese businessmen would take on a woman, either as a concubine or as even a wife. They would sometimes marry, although in New York and in most of the United States, interracial marriages were illegal. But you did have a number of Chinese who ended up staying, and their children were half Chinese and half white. And they constituted a sort of a unique little chapter in New York Chinese history. Well, eventually by 1882, everybody was getting so pissed off about the Chinese that Congress in Washington passed the Chinese Exclusion Acts. There were several of them. And it basically stopped Chinese immigration to the United States. The numbers grew very slowly. You see in New York, there were 200 Chinese, 1870, up to 2,000. Some kept sneaking in aboard ships. That was the main way of coming. Others who had worked on the railroads would be driven out of towns in the Midwest and the rural areas, would flee to New York. But once again, they were a male society. So there were no more Chinese immigrants. Even the government tried to get rid of the ones which were here, refused to give them citizenship to try to get rid of the Chinese population. As we're going to see in a minute, mass migration of the Chinese immigrants was only removed in 1965. Crucial year for American immigration history. Today in New York, there's probably 100,000. The population by 1965 started rising up by the thousands. Now, another group of people started migrating to New York. The Germans, the Irish, eventually, who had arrived in the 1840s and 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they got successful. And as soon as they could, they moved out. And so beginning in 1870, you had a whole new group of people taking over the Lower East Side. And these were Eastern European Jews who migrated from what was then the Russian Empire, which included Poland, the Austrian Empire, it was Czechoslovakia, Hungary, parts of Romania, Yugoslavia, and the Ukraine, which was part of Russia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And so a huge number came, mainly because of oppression by the Russian Orthodox under the Tsar. And so there was a mass migration. By 1900, there were 500,000 Orthodox Jews in the Lower East Side, crowded into tenements. You can see the picture on the right, street markets. That's where you bought your food. You can imagine these tenements in a hot summer day in July, over 100 degrees, unbelievable humidity. These people crammed into these tenements. Of course, diseases were rife. In the summer, there would be an epidemic of cholera or the flu, and tens of thousands of people would drop dead just because they were very often impoverished, had not enough food, they were malnourished, and they had no medical care. Most of them didn't speak English, they spoke Yiddish, they did what they could to survive. Now the Jewish Lower East Side has a very famous history because a lot of the Jews of places like Long Island, New Jersey, the Bronx, Queens, their ancestors came through the Lower East Side, the first stop. And of course, like anybody else, as soon as they got some money, they moved out and moved on. Well, this is when they took over the Beit Midrash Hagodol, where we saw earlier, and it became established the yeshiva, because there were Jews who realized that the only way they were going to survive in America was to get an education. Well, going to a yeshiva was fine. It was all Yiddish and Hebrew. You learned how to read the Bible and say your prayers, but it didn't get you a job. And if you had a wife and kids, you wanted and you needed a job. So the congregation started organizing a yeshiva. Gradually, they would introduce English language education. mathematics. And today, Yeshiva University, a giant building in Upper Manhattan, you can see the picture below, big modern red brick buildings, medicine, law school, everything you could possibly demand. So the Orthodox Jews realized that, number one, they were going to get out of the Lower East Side as quickly as they could, but they needed to learn modern urban skills. Another church which was taken over by the Orthodox was the English Methodist Church, which is built in 1826, going back to the English Methodist population. And in 1905, it was bought by an Orthodox group of Jews from a town in the Polish-Ukrainian border called Bialystoker. Well, Yiddish-speaking Orthodox Jews came over, they bought the synagogue. You see the picture on the right, the lavishly painted interior of the synagogue, beautiful colors. On the left, you see the Bialystoker Home for the Aged, which is still, last time I was there, still functions for a lot of the old elderly Jews who are still there. Now, if anybody's Jewish, you all know what a bialy is, which is the bread roll with a bit of jam in the middle of it with powdered sugar on it. This is a very common Eastern European pastry. And it's simply called a bialy. And it was introduced by the Orthodox Jews from Bialystoker when they arrived. Now, there were many other smaller synagogues, some which still exist, some which the building still exists, but not the congregation, or maybe has moved on or assimilated or disappeared. For example, we see the congregation B'nai Yaakov, the children of Jacob on Stanton Street, which is today an apartment building. But if you look close, you'll see that it has all the indications that it was a synagogue. Number one, it would have two doors, one for men, one for women. Women would go in, go up a flight of stairs into the women's section, which was isolated from the men's section. The men would go in one door. And sometimes these old synagogues, if you look closely, you'll see a little Star of David or some Hebrew carved into one of the stones. Another fascinating synagogue is the Kehillah Kadosha Janina, which is the one on the right. And these were Greek Jews. They're called Romaniot Jews because, according to their legends, they were Jews who, when the Romans destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, the Romans took shiploads of Jews back to Rome as slaves. Well, according to the Romaniot Jews, a shipload of Jews was wrecked off the coast of Greece. Well, these Jews knew that the Romans are going to be one step behind them and going to capture them because a boatload of slaves was worth money. And so they fled up into the mountains of Greece, where they developed their own language, their own way of praying, their own way of dressing, their own way of celebrating holidays. And gradually, some of them migrated to New York, where they built this synagogue on the right, which is today called the Romaniot, meaning the Jews who were taken by the Romans. Fascinating story. That one still functions as a synagogue. It has a good support group of people, most of them who have moved away, but they do go back to their synagogue. They have a little museum there describing the history of the Romaniot Jews. Now, the Orthodox Jewish Lower East Side, of course, built its infrastructure. On the left, you see the Daily Forward building from 1897. This is was the headquarters of the largest Yiddish-speaking newspaper in the world at that time. In Yiddish, it was called Vorwärts. It still publishes in English, Yiddish, and Russian. The building is right on East Broadway, and it is the tallest building. We'll see a couple pictures later on. Of course, like everything in the Lower East Side, it has gone through different owners. Today, it's owned by a group of Chinese businessmen who have taken it over. On the right is the Yarmolinsky's Bank, which was the largest Yiddish-speaking Jewish bank in the Lower East Side. Established in 1873 by Sender Yarmolinsky. And the current building was built, both of these buildings were built in 1911. It was a big real estate boom when the Jewish Lower East Side was at its fullest glory. Now the bank on the right, you can see it has that little tower on it. That tower has since disappeared, but the inscription along the front of the building gives the date 1873, founded, built 1911, Sender Yarmolinsky. It too is now a Chinese apartment building and office block. Now, these are some pictures. At the top on the left, you see the Daily Forward building. And just below that, you see the tower of the Forward building. At the top, you see the clock. And underneath it, written in Yiddish, is the name Vorwärts, which was the Yiddish name for the newspaper. I was so happy to see that when the Chinese took over that building, they didn't bother to cover over the signs. And so that's a bit of a historic period from 1911, which still can be seen. At the bottom on the right, we see the Mendel Goldberg fabric shop, which still exists. And every time I do a walking tour down there with my students, I half expect the building to be torn down. But the name is still there, and the fabric shop still functions. But it's one of these last survivors, which who knows how long it'll be gone. As you can see, the buildings on both the right and left are just rather modest, a couple floor, smaller buildings, which could be demolished at any time and replaced with something like above it. See that big blue building? There's a real architectural revolution happening in the Lower East Side. And buildings like this are taking over more and more. Almost every time I go down there, I'll see a place where something has disappeared and I want to show my students, but it's gone. Yiddish Theater flourished in the Lower East Side. We see the Russian Gypsy, the People's Theater, the Rabbi's Family, with an all-star cast. Some of these great stars of the Yiddish Theater of the Lower East Side, or cantors, who were cantors in the synagogues, went on to achieve fame as singers, as actors. You can see at the bottom on the right, it says Hebrew Publishing Company, Canal Street, New York, right through the middle of the Lower East Side. And this one was in a presentation in Yiddish of Leo Tolstoy's The Living Corpse. So they were not just unknown pieces that they were performing, but some of them were world classic literature published, translated into Yiddish. This is one of my favorite buildings, and that is still there. I don't know how long it's going to be there, but this is the Kletzer Brotherly Aid Society. The picture on the left, you can see it's now a Chinese aid society. Actually, it is a Chinese funeral home, because that's what it was. It was an Orthodox Jewish funeral home. The picture on the right just shows the marquee way up at the top, where it says 1892, the Kletzker, and then it says Brotherly Aid Society. Now, for any ethnic group, whether it's Irish Catholic or German Lutheran or Chinese Buddhist, funerals, funeral rituals, funeral customs are very important. And you see a tombstone at the bottom in a Jewish cemetery. So this was a building which, once again, they've preserved enough of it so that you can see way up in the top what it is. But the building has simply preserved the function. At one time it was burying Orthodox Jews, now it's burying Chinese. So this again was the golden age of the tenements, which began after the Civil War when there was money galore. You had a bunch of money that your father made in the Civil War. You wanted to invest it. So you would buy a bunch of older buildings in the Lower East Side, throw up tenements, and turn yourself into a slum landlord. These new immigrants, didn't know any better. They'd be piled 6 and 7 into a room. See the picture on the right, the laundry going out the back to the next building, people on the fire escapes. Sometimes 2 or 3 families would be living in an apartment with 2 or 3 rooms where everybody would sleep on the floor at night. They'd get up early in the morning. The men would go out looking for a job, and the women and children would stay at home and do sewing or make paper flowers or cook or make pastries to sell on the street. The golden age of tenements. Now, the crown and glory of the Jewish Lower East Side was the Eldridge Street Synagogue and Museum. See the picture on the left, they were doing some restoration. It is a very famous building, 1887, and it was a crowning glory for the well-to-do Orthodox Jews of the Lower East Side. In the synagogues, you paid for your seat, and so the rich people were up front. This was a class thing. The architecture, as you can see from the windows in the middle, this is what they call Hispano-Moorish, which means the architecture of Muslim Spain, which was one of the golden ages of the Jews in Spain until it ended with the Christian takeover of Spain from the Muslims. And so you can see that the synagogue has beautiful woodwork and beautiful inscriptions. Now, it functions as a museum. They have concerts there, but they also have a small synagogue in the basement, since there are so few Orthodox Jews left in that area. But they do everything they can to maintain it as a functioning house of worship, as well as a concert hall, lecture hall, and museum. Another building which is still there, which has become a Chinese rooming house and apartment building, was the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School. See, the date is in Hebrew, but the sign is still there, which I think is great because they do preserve a little bit of history. Either that, or they just simply didn't have the time to cover it over or tear it out. But it's nice to see that some bit of history is still remaining. The Educational Alliance is still there on East Broadway, right near Henry Street. This was an organization established by well-to-do German Reform Jews from uptown, who would hire teachers to go down to the Educational Alliance and train the Orthodox Jews in modern living skills. They would teach the girls to become secretaries, learn typing, shorthand, which nobody uses anymore. The boys would learn carpentry or plumbing. Also, the Orthodox, the Reform Jews were out to convert these poor Eastern European Jews to Reform Judaism, which is basically what happened. 500,000 Jews of the Lower East Side at the turn of the 1900s, the early 1900s, eventually disappeared. They ended up becoming Reform Jews or just losing their religion, changing their names, assimilating, and have totally disappeared as a distinct ethnic group. Now that brings us up to the current period. The gates of immigration closed at around World War I. During the war, very few refugees or very few immigrants came over. It was a war. After the war, the United States decided it had enough immigrants Ellis Island was shut down. It was almost impossible for new immigrants to come to the United States from about the 1920s until 1965. In 1965, Congress voted to open the gates of immigration again. And they remained open till about September 11, 2001. And now with Donald Trump, they are definitely closed. And so this period, 65 to 2001, saw a huge migration of, first group were Chinese who settled in the Lower East Side. Finally, the Exclusion Acts were overruled and the Chinese were allowed to migrate in huge numbers. They have not only expanded the small Chinatown around Mott Street to take over Little Italy, but also taken over the Lower East Side. Here we see a big synagogue built in 1903, the high point of Jewish immigration to the Lower East Side, the congregation B'nai Kalwari. Today, it is a Buddhist temple. In Chinatown itself, the estimated population is 100,000, approaching 1 million in New York City. Chinese now are the largest immigrant group who came into the city, even outnumbering Mexicans. They brought their culture with them. So very often you'll see celebrations of the Chinese New Year happening in Chinatown through the Lower East Side. Confucius Plaza, a monumental, giant Chinese housing development, 1975. And you see right nearby is the statue of Confucius. The Chinese have also organized the Museum of the Chinese in America, which began at an old school on the left. I remember visiting it there, the Museum of the Chinese in America, called MoCA, on Mulberry Street in 1980. It moved to Center Street in a brand new building where they had magnificent exhibits. They had a fire recently. I believe it's currently closed. But I've taken groups to visit the museum, an absolutely thrilling panorama of Chinese in America and New York City. Well, the Chinese have basically taken over the Lower East Side. Now all the synagogues are very often Buddhist temples. In fact, there are houses of worship in the Lower East Side that began as a Protestant church back in the early 1800s, became a Catholic church when the Irish were there, became an Orthodox synagogue, and today is a Buddhist temple. So this is the Lower East Side. Now, what about the future? Well, when I give walking tours, I point out all the history and what remains and talk about the current status. But I always finish up by saying, probably the next time I give a tour of the Lower East Side, before I retire from Touro College, that the new immigrant group coming in will be aliens from Mars or from Jupiter or who knows where. They'll arrive, like all the other immigrants who arrived, or have to learn English, have to get a job, adjust to American ways. You can imagine the aliens getting used to American food. I mean, that's going to be a big challenge when they arrive. But they'll gradually take over the Lower East Side, and there'll be a whole new chapter in the history of the Lower East Side. So that's something to look forward to. You know, I'll probably still be teaching at the rate things are going. So it will be an interesting experience. So at this point, I will log off. Here again, that's me giving a tour in the fall of the Lower East Side with a gang of my students. You can see back then I still had some color in my hair. If anybody has any questions or comments or would like some extra information on something, this is the address I use for people who watch these videos. It's Ron Brown Media at gmail.com. Very easy to remember. So feel free to send me an email, or if you want more information or whatever. It should be interesting.